The fan snapped open with a sound sharp enough to cut through the music. "Good heavens," Lady Drummond murmured loudly to the women clustered around her. "Miss Vane still attends these things? One must admire such perseverance." A few ladies laughed, not kindly. Lucinda Vane heard every word. She stood at the far edge of the Castleton ballroom beneath a chandelier blazing with 1,000 candle flames, the polished marble floor glowing like pale ice beneath the dancers' shoes. Silk skirts brushed past her without touching. Conversations curved neatly around her as if she were an inconvenient piece of furniture. 9 seasons of London society had perfected the art of pretending she did not exist, except when they wished to mock her. Lucinda did not lower her eyes. She had learned long ago that lowering them only invited more attention. Instead, she adjusted the ivory shawl resting lightly across her shoulders. Not to hide, never to hide. The scars along the left side of her face caught the candlelight in thin silver lines that ran from jaw to temple. They were not grotesque. Time had softened them into something almost delicate. But they were unmistakable. And unmistakable in London society meant unforgivable. 9 years ago, when she had been 18 and newly arrived for her first season, she had been simply another hopeful daughter among dozens. Not beautiful enough to command attention, not plain enough to provoke remark. Just another girl in a pale gown hoping for a respectable match. Until the morning on Oxford Street, until the burning, until the hired man who had vanished into the crowd. She had never spoken publicly of what she believed had happened, but she had always known. Lord Gerald Stern. The memory passed through her like a cold draft through an old house. Across the ballroom, the musicians began another waltz. Couples stepped onto the floor. Laughter rose again. The moment of ridicule passed easily for everyone except its subject. Lucinda reached calmly for her reticule. She was leaving. 9 seasons were enough. Enough whispered cruelty. Enough polite indifference. Enough empty chairs at concert halls and dance cards that never filled. She would return to her father's small house in Surrey. She would manage the garden, read books no one else cared about, and live a life that did not require her to stand beneath chandeliers while strangers judged her survival. Her gloved fingers closed around the door handle leading to the terrace. "Miss Vane." The voice behind her was quiet, but it carried. Lucinda turned. The man standing there was not smiling. He was tall enough that people nearby instinctively stepped aside without realizing why. His coat was black, unfashionably severe in a room devoted to glittering color, and the candlelight caught the sharp planes of a face that looked as if it had been carved with intention rather than inherited. A faint scar ran along his jaw. His eyes were gray, not the flat gray of fog, the gray of a winter sea before a storm. Lucinda knew who he was immediately. Everyone in London did. Rhys Calloway, the Duke of Silverton, war veteran, political troublemaker, a man whispered about in Parliament corridors and feared in drawing rooms. A duke with too much power and far too little patience for society's rules. And he was looking directly at her face. All of it. Not politely avoiding the scars, not staring with curiosity. Just looking. Fully. As though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. He extended his hand. "I would be grateful," he said calmly, "if you would dance with me." The ballroom changed. Not visibly, but the air shifted. Conversations faltered. Fans paused mid-flutter. The subtle currents of attention that ruled every gathering in London turned slowly and irresistibly toward them. Lucinda felt it instantly. Of course they were watching. The most feared duke in England had just asked the most unmarriageable woman in London to dance. She studied his face. "Why?" she asked plainly. A flicker crossed his expression. Not amusement. Recognition. "Because," he said, "you were about to leave." He paused. "And I would prefer that you stayed." Lucinda searched his eyes carefully. 9 years had made her an expert at reading the subtle humiliations of polite society. The pity disguised as kindness, the curiosity disguised as gallantry, the wager disguised as charm. She saw none of them. "I do not dance," she said quietly. "Not anymore." Silence stretched between them. Behind her, the ballroom waited. Calloway inclined his head once. "Very well." He did not argue. He did not smile. He simply stepped aside. Lucinda turned and walked out onto the terrace. The cool night air brushed her skin as the doors closed behind her, muffling the music. The garden beyond the stone balustrade lay quiet beneath the May sky. She had taken perhaps 10 steps toward the path when she heard another set of footsteps. Behind her, she turned again. Rhys Calloway had followed. Of course he had. He stood a few paces away beneath the shadow of a climbing rose arch, his hands loosely clasped behind his back. "Forgive me," he said evenly. "Approaching you in a ballroom where half of London could watch was inefficient." Lucinda folded her arms. "You should not have approached me at all." "Yes," he agreed immediately. "You are correct." She blinked. That had not been the response she expected. He studied her for a moment. "May I have 5 minutes of your time?" he asked. "And then I will leave you entirely alone." Lucinda hesitated. The man before her was dangerous in ways London society whispered about but never explained fully. Yet something in his expression, something steady and deeply controlled, made refusal strangely difficult. "You have 5 minutes," she said. He nodded once. "Thank you." Then he said the most astonishing thing she had heard in 9 years. "I need a wife." Lucinda stared at him. He continued calmly. "It is a practical matter. Certain votes in Parliament will not align themselves behind an unmarried duke. I require a duchess." The absurdity of the moment nearly made her laugh. "You have the entire unmarried female population of England available to you," she said. "Yes." His gaze did not leave her face. "I have chosen you." The garden fell silent. Lucinda felt the old instinctive defenses rising, the reflex to assume mockery, to expect cruelty hidden beneath civility. "Why?" she asked again. This time the answer came slowly. "Because," Rhys Calloway said, "I know what Lord Gerald Stern did to you." The night seemed to stop breathing. Lucinda's heart slammed against her ribs. He continued quietly, "I know the name of the man who threw the vitriol on Oxford Street." Her fingers tightened on the stone railing. "I know who paid him." A pause. "And I intend to destroy him." Lucinda turned slowly toward him. The gray eyes watching her were no longer calm. There was something else in them now. Fury, cold, patient fury. "And marrying me," she said carefully, "would help you accomplish that?" "Yes." He did not hesitate. "It would give you my protection, my name." Another pause. "And it would ensure that no one in England ever speaks to you the way Lady Drummond did tonight again." The music from the ballroom drifted faintly through the glass doors. Lucinda studied him. The most powerful man she had ever met was offering her revenge, and something else she had never dared imagine. "Power. I will consider it," she said finally. He inclined his head. "Take as long as you require." Lucinda turned back toward the ballroom doors. But before she could open them, Calloway spoke again. "Miss Vane." She looked back. His voice had softened slightly. "For what it is worth." His gaze rested briefly on the scars along her cheek. Not flinching, not pitying, just seeing. "You have endured something most people would not have survived." Lucinda felt something unfamiliar move in her chest. He stepped aside, leaving the choice entirely hers. For the first time in 9 years, Lucinda Vane walked back into a ballroom not as a ghost, but as the woman the most dangerous duke in England had just chosen, and half of London was about to lose its mind. By the following morning, all of London knew. The announcement appeared in the Morning Post, just after breakfast, printed in small but unmistakable type. "His Grace the Duke of Silverton is pleased to announce his engagement to Miss Lucinda Vane." The reaction was immediate and merciless. Lady Drummond read the line twice before setting the newspaper down with surgical precision beside her untouched coffee. "Impossible," she said. Yet the ink remained exactly where it was. Across Mayfair, drawing rooms erupted into speculation. At Almack's that afternoon, 2 dowagers nearly came to blows debating whether the Duke had lost his senses or simply developed a peculiar sense of humor. And in the quieter corners of London society, a far more unsettling thought circulated. Rhys Calloway did nothing without reason, which meant this marriage had one. Lucinda, meanwhile, was sitting in her modest writing room with her only true friend in London. Nora Fitch read the newspaper once, then again. Then she folded it neatly and placed it on the table. "You are engaged," Nora said slowly, "to the most dangerous duke in England." Lucinda stirred her tea. "Yes." Nora leaned back in her chair. "And this was voluntary?" "Yes." "Good." Nora paused. "Because if you had been coerced, I was prepared to murder him with the fireplace poker." Lucinda smiled faintly. Nora studied her carefully. "You believe him?" she asked. Lucinda did not need to ask what she meant. "He knows about Stern," she said quietly. Nora's expression sharpened. "And?" "He claims to have proof." Silence stretched between them. Nora tapped her fingers thoughtfully against the table. "If that is true," she said slowly, "then your Duke is not merely dangerous." She looked up. "He is useful." Lucinda exhaled. "Nora." "Yes?" I'm about to become a duchess. Nora blinked. Then she burst into laughter. My dear Lucinda, she said between breaths. London society has spent 9 years pretending you do not exist. She lifted the newspaper again. Now you are about to outrank all of them. That evening, Lucinda stepped from the Calloway carriage onto the steps of the Hanover Square rooms. The concert hall glittered with candlelight, and every head turned, not subtly, not discreetly, every single head. Whispers rippled through the crowd. That's her? The scarred girl? The Duke's fiancée? Lucinda kept her chin lifted. 9 years of practice made that easy. Beside her, Rhys Calloway offered his arm. His posture was relaxed. But there was something in the stillness of him, something quiet and lethal that discouraged anyone from approaching too closely. They entered the hall together. The murmur followed them like a tide. Lucinda felt every glance slide across her face. But for the first time in 9 years, no one laughed, because the man beside her was watching the room with the cool attention of a general surveying a battlefield. And no one in London wished to be on the wrong side of the Duke of Silverton. They reached their seats. The orchestra began to tune. Lucinda leaned slightly closer to him. Lady Drummond, she murmured, is staring at us. I know, he said calmly. How can you tell? She has stopped blinking. Lucinda almost laughed. Across the hall, Lady Drummond's fan snapped open again. Conversation flowed around them. The music began, and for several minutes the world quieted. Lucinda closed her eyes as the orchestra moved into Mozart. The slow movement unfolded like sunlight through water. She did not notice the silence beside her until the music ended. When she opened her eyes again, Rhys Calloway was watching her. Not the orchestra. Her. You listen, he said quietly, as though the music is somewhere inside your mind rather than the room. Lucinda blinked. No one has ever said that to me before. I noticed it 3 years ago. Her breath caught. 3 years? Yes. At this very hall. He paused. You were sitting beside an empty chair. Lucinda stared at him. You remember that? I remember you. The words were simple, but something in the way he said them made her pulse quicken. You were alone, he continued. Another lady approached, saw your face, and chose a different seat. Lucinda felt heat rise in her throat. Yes, she said quietly. I remember. I wondered then, Calloway said, how a person continues walking through a world that behaves that way. His voice had grown lower. Most people would have hidden. Lucinda folded her hands in her lap. I considered it. But you didn't. No. He studied her face for a long moment. The scars caught the candlelight again. Good, he said. A small silence settled between them. Then he added almost casually, Lord Stern is here tonight. Lucinda's spine stiffened. Where? Across the hall. She followed his gaze, and there he was. Gerald Stern stood near the far wall beside 2 gentlemen, a glass of champagne in his hand. Older now, softer, but the arrogance remained unmistakable. And he was staring directly at her. Lucinda felt the familiar cold weight settle in her chest. 9 years of silence. 9 years of watching him move through society untouched. But then Calloway's voice broke into her thoughts. Do you wish to leave? She looked at him. No. He nodded once. Good. His gray eyes returned to Stern. Neither do I. Lucinda followed his gaze again. And for the first time since Oxford Street, Gerald Stern looked uneasy. Not frightened. Not yet. But uncertain, as though something in the room had shifted in a way he could not quite name. Lucinda leaned closer to Calloway. What happens now? She asked softly. His expression did not change. We wait. For what? For the right moment. His voice dropped even lower. And when it comes, the faintest shadow of a smile touched his mouth. I burn his entire world to the ground. Across the hall, Gerald Stern raised his glass. But when his eyes met the Duke of Silverton's gaze, the glass trembled, very slightly, and Lucinda Vane realized something she had never felt before. Gerald Stern was no longer the most dangerous man in the room. 3 nights later, London society gathered beneath the blazing chandeliers of Lady Farwell's garden ball. Lanterns glowed among the roses. Music drifted from the open doors of the ballroom. The scent of summer blossoms hung warm in the air. And everywhere Lucinda walked, whispers followed. Not cruel ones, curious ones, speculative ones. The ton had not yet decided what to make of the Duke of Silverton's fiancée. For 9 years they had dismissed her entirely. Now the same woman walked through their parties with the most feared Duke in England at her side. People were recalculating. Lucinda felt the change in the air like the shift before a storm. She stood near the marble fountain speaking with Nora when a gentleman approached. Miss Vane, he bowed politely. Lord Aubrey Castle, 30 years old. Recently returned from India, known for charm that was far less practiced than most men of his rank. I hope I am not intruding, he said easily. Not at all, Lucinda replied. Cassell smiled warmly. I was told you were the most interesting person at this party. Lucinda lifted an eyebrow. By whom? Miss Fitch. Nora did not even attempt to look innocent. Cassell chuckled. I believe her exact words were that everyone else here was either dull or dishonest. Nora sipped her lemonade serenely. I stand by that assessment. Lucinda found herself laughing softly. For 20 minutes they spoke easily about books, about travel, about music. Cassell listened without the careful politeness she had grown accustomed to. He simply listened, and Lucinda realized with mild surprise that she was enjoying herself. Then something changed. Not in the conversation, in the air. She felt it before she saw it. A stillness moving through the garden like a shadow across water. Lucinda turned. At the far edge of the rosebed stood Rhys Calloway. He held a glass of champagne, untouched. His expression was perfectly neutral, but his gray eyes were fixed on Lord Cassell. Cassell continued speaking. I wondered if I might call on you sometime. She is engaged. The voice came from directly beside Lucinda. Calloway had crossed the garden without either of them noticing. He stood at her shoulder now, not touching her, not blocking Cassell's path, simply present, and suddenly the warm summer garden felt considerably colder. Cassell blinked. Then recognition dawned. Your Grace. His tone remained polite, but his posture shifted slightly, the instinctive response of a man realizing he had wandered unknowingly into dangerous territory. I was not aware, Cassell said. My apologies, Miss Vane. Lucinda opened her mouth. Calloway spoke first. It is quite all right. His voice was perfectly civil, but the quiet weight behind it was unmistakable. Cassell bowed once more. Congratulations. Then he withdrew gracefully across the lawn. Lucinda watched him go. Only after Cassell disappeared into the crowd did she turn to Calloway. You were very present, she said. Yes. He did nothing wrong. No. A pause. You glared at him. I did not glare. She studied him. You absolutely did. The corner of his mouth moved faintly. I was observing. You were observing him like a general considering artillery placement. He looked thoughtful. That is not inaccurate. Lucinda shook her head, half amused. You are impossible. I have been told this before. The music drifted across the garden again. Lucinda glanced toward the ballroom doors. Were you jealous? Calloway did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied the climbing roses beside them. I found, he said finally, that I had a strong preference for being present during that conversation. Lucinda felt something warm and dangerous stir beneath her ribs, the kind of feeling that grew slowly, quietly, until suddenly it was impossible to ignore. She looked away quickly. We should return inside. He offered his arm. She took it. As they walked toward the ballroom doors, Lucinda noticed Lady Drummond approaching from the opposite path. The lady's smile was brilliant, sharp as glass. Your Grace, Lady Drummond said sweetly. Miss Vane, what a fascinating engagement this has become. Lucinda felt the familiar old tension begin to coil in her chest. But Calloway spoke before she could answer. Lady Drummond, he said calmly. His voice was pleasant, almost friendly. I was recently informed of an interesting matter concerning Lord Hereford's granddaughter. The fan in Lady Drummond's hand paused mid-flutter. 17 years old, Calloway continued conversationally. Excluded from Almac's last season after a rather curious arrangement. Lady Drummond's smile tightened. I believe, he added mildly, that arrangement may soon require investigation. Silence fell between them. Lucinda watched realization dawn slowly in Lady Drummond's eyes. Calloway inclined his head politely. Good evening. He turned away without another word. Lucinda followed him toward the ballroom. Behind them, Lady Drummond stood very still among the roses. When they reached the doorway, Lucinda glanced sideways at him. You did that deliberately? Yes. Why? Calloway looked down at her. Because he said it with absolute calm. No one humiliates my future wife. The word struck something deep inside her. Something she had spent 9 years convincing herself she no longer needed. Protection, not pity, not charity. Protection. Lucinda looked forward again as they stepped into the blazing ballroom light, and she realized with a quiet shock, for the first time since she was 18, She did not feel alone in the room. The letters began 3 days later. They arrived without postmarks. No handwriting she recognized. Just thin sheets of folded paper slipped beneath the door of her writing room or placed quietly among the morning correspondence. The first one said only, "You should reconsider the engagement." Lucinda burned it. The second arrived the following afternoon. "There are things that can still be said." She burned that one too. By the third letter, she no longer pretended she did not know who had sent them. Gerald Stern had always preferred intimidation to confrontation. Threats whispered behind drawing-room doors. Rumors planted carefully among acquaintances. Quiet reminders that a woman's reputation was easier to destroy than a man's. Lucinda folded the letter calmly and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk. She would not show it to Calloway. Not yet. Old habits were difficult to abandon. For 9 years she had carried the truth alone. Asking for help still felt unnatural, but that habit was about to cost her dearly. 2 mornings later, Stern walked into Calloway House. Uninvited, Lucinda was sitting in the small writing room overlooking the east garden when the door opened without warning. She looked up. Gerald Stern stood in the doorway. 9 years had softened him slightly. His once handsome face had thickened at the jaw, and faint lines pulled at the corners of his mouth. But the arrogance remained untouched. "Miss Vane," he said smoothly. Lucinda set down her pen. "You are trespassing." "Yes," he agreed easily, closing the door behind him. He leaned against the desk across from her. "You must end the engagement." Lucinda stared at him. "I beg your pardon?" "Calloway believes he has evidence," Stern continued. "He does not." A thin smile curved his mouth. "Whatever he thinks he knows, it will not survive scrutiny." Lucinda rose slowly from her chair. "You should leave." Stern's eyes flicked briefly to the scars along her cheek. "Did you truly think marrying a duke would erase what you are?" The old familiar cold began to creep through her chest. "You were fortunate once," Stern continued softly. "You refused me publicly. I allowed you to survive the consequences." Lucinda's hands trembled. "Not from fear, from fury. You arranged that attack," she said quietly. "Prove it." His voice was almost amused. "You have no witnesses, no evidence." He stepped closer. "If you end the engagement now, the matter can still remain onward private." Lucinda met his gaze steadily. "No." Stern's expression hardened. "Then perhaps your fiancé should learn what truly happened that morning on Oxford Street." Lucinda felt the words strike like ice. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Stern said pleasantly, "that accidents sometimes happen to women who invite attention." The door opened behind him. "I strongly recommend," said a quiet voice, "that you stop speaking." Gerald Stern froze. Rhys Calloway stood in the doorway. He had not raised his voice. But the air in the room changed instantly. Stern turned slowly. "Your Grace." Calloway stepped inside. His gray eyes moved first to Lucinda, not to Stern, checking, measuring, ensuring she was unhurt. Only then did his attention shift. "Get out of my house," he said calmly. Stern laughed softly. "You misunderstand the situation." "I do not misunderstand anything." Calloway took another step forward. "You are finished, Stern." Something flickered across Stern's face. Fear, not much, but enough. "You cannot prove—" "I can." Silence filled the room. Calloway's voice dropped. "I know the man who threw the vitriol." Stern went pale. "I know what you paid him." Another step closer. "And I know the names of 2 other women you paid men to punish when they refused you." Lucinda's breath caught. 2 others. Calloway's gaze never left Stern's face. "You have lived 12 years believing those women could never speak against you." A long pause. That assumption was incorrect. Stern stared at him. "You will regret this," he said finally. Calloway did not blink. "You already do." The silence stretched. Then Stern turned sharply and walked out of the room. The door closed behind him. Lucinda remained standing very still. Calloway crossed the room immediately. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Did he threaten you?" She hesitated. Then she opened the desk drawer and removed the letters. Calloway read them without expression. But the stillness that settled over him was colder than anger. "How long?" he asked. 3 weeks. He looked up. Lucinda lifted her chin. "I am accustomed to managing things myself." Calloway studied her quietly. "Yes," he said. "I can see that." He folded the letters carefully and slipped them into his coat. After a moment, he said something that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "You should not have had to manage this alone." Lucinda looked away. "I have had practice." His voice softened slightly. "Not anymore." She met his gaze again. Something changed in that moment. Not the arrangement, not the plan to destroy Stern. Something deeper, something quieter, and far more dangerous. Calloway's hand rested briefly over hers on the desk. "We end this," he said. "At the Northcote Ball." Lucinda nodded slowly. "When half of London is watching?" "Yes." His gray eyes darkened. "He humiliated you publicly." A pause. "So I will ruin him the same way." Lucinda felt a strange calm settle over her. 9 years of silence were finally about to end. But later that night, as she passed the library door, she heard Calloway speaking with Lord Barton Fell inside. "You cannot continue pretending the original reasons are the only ones," Fell was saying. Lucinda paused. Calloway's voice answered quietly. "She was chosen for practical reasons." Lucinda felt the words like a blade. Practical. Of course. The marriage had always been an arrangement. She stepped back silently from the doorway and left before hearing the rest. Lucinda left Calloway House before dawn. She packed quietly, taking only what she had brought with her when the engagement began. No gowns purchased with the Silverton fortune, no jewels from the family vault he had mentioned with such careless wealth. Those belonged to a duchess, and she, it seemed, had mistaken the role she played. The carriage rolled through the pale gray streets of London toward Marylebone Lane, where Nora Fitch kept her modest lodgings. Lucinda stared out the window the entire journey. Practical reasons. The words repeated in her mind with relentless clarity. Of course, the marriage was practical. She had known that from the beginning. She had agreed to it. So why did it feel like something inside her chest had been quietly broken open? Nora answered the door in her dressing gown. One look at Lucinda's face and she stepped aside without asking a single question. Tea appeared, blankets, and the calm silence of a woman who understood that explanations sometimes came later. They sat together for nearly an hour before Nora finally spoke. "What happened?" Lucinda stared into her teacup. "I heard him speaking to Lord Fell." Nora waited. "He said he chose me for practical reasons." Nora sighed slowly. "And you left?" "Yes." Lucinda's voice remained steady. "I was foolish to think the arrangement had become anything else." Nora watched her carefully. "You heard the entire conversation?" "No." "You left before he finished?" "Yes." Nora closed her eyes briefly. "My dear Lucinda." "What?" "You are possibly the most intelligent woman I know." A pause. "And you are also occasionally spectacularly stupid." Lucinda blinked. "Thank you." "You heard half a sentence and built an entire tragedy from it." Lucinda looked away. "Nora." "Did he come after you?" Lucinda hesitated. "No." Nora leaned back thoughtfully. "That," she said slowly, "may not mean what you think it means." Lucinda did not answer. The first day passed quietly. The second was worse. There was no anger left in her, only a strange hollow stillness where something warmer had begun to grow in recent weeks. She realized with uncomfortable clarity just how accustomed she had become to Calloway's presence. The quiet steadiness of him, the way he listened, the way he never once pretended not to see her scars. And worst of all, the way he looked at her, as though she were something specific, something rare. She had been a fool to believe that look meant anything. On the morning of the third day, Lucinda stood before Nora's small mirror. "You are being ridiculous," she told her own reflection. "You left before he finished speaking." The woman in the mirror looked equally unconvinced. Lucinda sighed. She turned toward the door. "I need to return." Nora, who had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment, nodded. "Yes." Lucinda reached for her gloves. Just as the sound of carriage wheels stopped outside, both women froze. A moment later, a knock. Lucinda opened the door herself. Rhys Calloway stood on the step, alone. He had not sent a servant, which meant he had walked, from Mayfair, across half of London. His coat was slightly rumpled, and he looked as though he had slept very little. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then he said quietly, "Lucinda." She stepped aside. "I was just coming to see you." Something flickered across his face. Relief. He entered the small sitting room. Nora appeared from the kitchen, took one glance at them both, and immediately collected her hat. "I have an errand," she announced. Then she vanished out the door with remarkable efficiency. Calloway and Lucinda were alone. He remained standing. "You heard my conversation with Barton Fell?" "Yes." "Part of it." She lifted her chin slightly. "I heard enough." Calloway studied her for a long moment. Then he said something very simple. "You did not." Lucinda felt her pulse quicken. "You heard the beginning," he continued calmly. "You did not hear the rest." She waited. "The practical reasons," he said, "were why I approached you at the Castleton ball." A pause. They are not why I continued. Lucinda's breath caught. Calloway stepped closer. They stopped being the reason approximately 3 weeks later. When? She whispered. At breakfast. She blinked. What? When you informed me, he said evenly, that if I ever treated you with condescension, you would leave without hesitation. A faint shadow of a smile touched his mouth. I found that possibility extremely unacceptable. Lucinda stared at him. That is not the reaction of a man managing a practical arrangement. He hesitated briefly. I am not particularly skilled at discussing emotions. I noticed. But I will attempt clarity. He took a slow breath. I watched you for 3 years before speaking to you. Lucinda's heart stopped. You, what? 3 years ago, he continued, at the Hanover Square Concert Hall. You were listening to Mozart with your eyes closed. He looked directly at her, and I could not stop thinking about it. The room felt suddenly smaller. I'm not a man who finds it easy to care about specific things, he said quietly. War and intelligence work make that complicated. Another pause. But you became something specific. His voice lowered, and once that happened, his jaw tightened slightly. It became impossible to pretend the arrangement was merely practical. Lucinda felt her throat tighten. What are you saying? Calloway held her gaze. I am saying, he said steadily, I have been in love with you for 3 years. The words landed like thunder in the quiet room. Lucinda stared at him. You should have said that sooner, she whispered. Yes. I have also been in love with you, she added. Calloway blinked. What? Since the night in the library. A breathless silence followed. Then Lucinda stepped closer and placed her hand against his chest. His heart was beating much faster than usual. You are a very foolish man, she said softly. Yes. You could have avoided a great deal of misery if you had simply said this weeks ago. That is true. Lucinda smiled faintly. Fortunately, she said, we appear to be equally foolish. And then he kissed her. 2 nights before the Northcott ball, Gerald Stern made one final attempt to reclaim control. It happened at Lady Petton's supper. A small gathering of 12 guests where conversation was meant to be civilized, and reputations were often decided between courses. Lucinda attended alone. Ree had been called to Surrey on urgent estate business that morning, though he had hesitated before leaving. Send word immediately if anything feels wrong, he had told her. Lucinda had smiled faintly. I have survived 9 years without your supervision, Your Grace. I am aware, he said quietly. That does not mean I enjoy it. She thought of those words later when Stern walked into Lady Petton's dining room. He arrived late, just as the fish course was being served. Lucinda understood the moment she saw him that his presence had been carefully arranged. One final performance, one last attempt to humiliate her before the world learned what he truly was. Stern took his seat 4 places down the table. For 20 minutes he said nothing. The conversation flowed around him. Politics, music, the usual safe subjects of civilized company. Then Stern set down his wineglass. I understand, he said loudly enough for half the table to hear, that the Duke of Silverton has taken on a rather unusual charity this season. The room fell very still. Lucinda felt every pair of eyes turned toward her. Stern continued pleasantly. Such generosity. One wonders what inspires a man of his rank to rescue something society has so thoroughly rejected. No one spoke. The insult hung in the air like smoke. Lucinda set down her fork. Slowly, deliberately. 9 years ago she would have lowered her eyes. Tonight she looked directly at him. Lord Stern, she said calmly. Her voice carried across the table with effortless clarity. I have noticed over the years that you are most cruel when you are most frightened. Stern's smile faltered slightly. What precisely, Lucinda continued, are you frightened of tonight? Silence thickened around them. Stern leaned back in his chair. I merely... You chose this moment carefully, Lucinda said. My fiancé is not present, the table is small, the audience respectable. She held his gaze. And yet I believe you have miscalculated. Stern's jaw tightened. Have I? Lucinda's voice remained perfectly steady. I believe there is a document currently circulating among several gentlemen in London. A ripple moved through the guests. It describes events on Oxford Street 9 years ago. Stern went pale. And I believe, Lucinda continued softly, that the men currently holding that document are deciding the most useful way to present it publicly. The silence became absolute. Stern stared at her. Lucinda leaned forward slightly. You spent 9 years believing I would remain silent because I had no power. Her eyes did not leave his. That assumption was incorrect. Stern said nothing. He stood abruptly from the table. Lady Petton, who had listened to every word from the head of the table, set down her napkin. Lord Stern, she said crisply, I believe you have mistaken my hospitality for tolerance. Her voice was cold. You will not do so again. Stern left before the dessert course. The door closed behind him with quiet finality. Lucinda remained seated. Her hands did not tremble, not even slightly. Lady Petton looked at her thoughtfully. My dear, she said after a moment, I should like you to sit beside me for the remainder of the evening. Lucinda moved seats. Conversation resumed slowly. But something had shifted. The old balance of power was gone. For the first time in 9 years, Gerald Stern had been the one forced to retreat. Later that night, Lucinda wrote a brief note to Ree. Stern attended Lady Petton's supper. I handled it. Come home soon. He arrived at dawn the next morning. He had ridden through the night. Lucinda found him in the library with the note still in his hand. You handled it? He asked quietly. Yes. She described the evening calmly. When she finished, Ree was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. I wish I had been there. I know. His jaw tightened. He will not attempt that again. Lucinda looked at him steadily. The Northcott ball is in 2 days. Yes. And that is when everything ends. Ree nodded once. He believes he still has influence. A pause. He does not. Lucinda studied his face. You are very certain? I am. He stepped closer. The gray eyes that met hers were colder than she had ever seen them. At the Northcott ball, he said quietly, Gerald Stern will discover what it means to threaten something that belongs to me. Lucinda felt a strange shiver run through her. Not fear. Something else. Something powerful. Belongs to you? She asked softly. Ree's expression shifted. He realized the words he had used. Then, very deliberately, he said, You belong to yourself. A pause. But I will still destroy him. Lucinda smiled faintly. Good. Because in 2 days, half of London would watch it happen. The Northcott ball glittered like a crown jewel of the London season. 1,200 candles burned in the chandeliers above the marble floor. Music spilled through the enormous ballroom in a sweep of violins and laughter. Diamonds flashed at every turn of a fan. Half of England's aristocracy had gathered beneath that roof, which was precisely why Rhys Calloway had chosen this night. Lucinda stepped from the carriage onto the grand staircase of Northcott House wearing deep blue silk that shimmered beneath the lantern light. A single strand of pearls rested against her throat. The Duke of Silverton's mother's pearls. Rhys stood beside her, tall and entirely still in black evening dress. He offered his arm. Lucinda took it. Together they entered the ballroom. And the room noticed. The whispers moved quickly. The Duke. Miss Vane. Tonight is the night. Lucinda could feel it. Anticipation. London society loved spectacle. And tonight something was clearly coming. Across the ballroom, Gerald Stern stood near the card-room doors. When he saw them enter, his expression froze. For the first time since Oxford Street 9 years ago. He looked uncertain. Lucinda felt Rhee's hand tighten slightly over hers. Are you ready? He murmured. She lifted her chin. I have been ready for 9 years. He nodded once. Then he began to move. Not quickly, not dramatically. The most powerful men in the room approached Stern one by one. Lord Barton Fell, Lord Ashbury, and finally Lord Hereford, whose reputation for justice carried enormous weight in Parliament. A document passed quietly between them. No one raised their voice. No one created a scene. But the men around Stern stepped away, gradually, deliberately, and that was worse than shouting, because every person in the ballroom noticed. Lucinda watched Stern's face as realization spread through it. First confusion, then denial, then something far more terrifying. Understanding. Lord Hereford spoke quietly. The testimony of the man hired to throw vitriol on Oxford Street was read aloud. Names were mentioned. Payments. Dates. 2 other women. 2. Lucinda felt the breath leave her lungs. Rhee's thumb pressed gently against her hand. Across the room, Stern argued, denied, protested. But the 4 men simply listened, then stepped away. And in that moment, London society made its decision. Within minutes, the whispers began. Within an hour, the room had turned its back on Gerald Stern completely. And by the time the orchestra began the next waltz, he was gone. Lucinda watched him leave the ballroom through the great doors. 9 years of silence walked out with him. She exhaled slowly. Not triumph, not vengeance, just release. The kind of quiet release that came when a long-held weight was finally lifted. "I think," she said softly, "that a door has just closed." "Yes," Ree replied. "It has." She stepped out onto the terrace for air. The July night spread wide above the garden. Stars glittered beyond the lanterns. Music drifted faintly through the open doors behind her. For several minutes she simply stood there breathing. 9 years. 9 seasons of whispers and empty chairs and cruelty disguised as civility. And now it was finished. She heard his footsteps behind her. Ree stopped beside her at the balustrade. Neither of them spoke immediately. Finally he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." She turned toward him. The expression on his face was the one she had begun to recognize. The unguarded one. "I love you," he said. The words were simple, direct. And then almost immediately he added, "You're not required to say it back." Lucinda stared at him. "In what world," she asked slowly, "do you imagine I do not love you as well?" He blinked. "You do?" "Of course I do." She stepped closer. "I have loved you since the night you told me surviving was enough." Ree looked momentarily stunned. Then his hands rose slowly. He touched the scarred side of her face without hesitation, just as he had in the morning room weeks ago. His fingers traced the faint silver line along her cheek. "This," he said quietly, "is still not damage." Lucinda smiled softly. "I know." He leaned closer. "May I kiss you?" "Yes." Obviously, yes. He kissed her beneath the July stars while the waltz played inside the ballroom. His hands cradled her face, scars and all, like something precious rather than broken. For a long moment the world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested lightly against hers. "I saw you once," he murmured, 3 years ago in a concert hall. "You told me. You closed your eyes during the Mozart Adagio." Lucinda laughed softly. "I needed somewhere quiet. I wanted to know what was happening inside your mind." "And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now I do." Inside the ballroom, the orchestra swelled into another waltz. Lucinda slipped her hand into his. "Come," she said. "I do not dance." "I know." He offered his hand anyway. She took it, and together they returned to the ballroom where 9 years earlier she had learned to stand alone. Tonight she did not stand alone. Tonight the Duke of Silverton held her hand, and every person in London understood something they had not understood before. Lucinda Vane had never been invisible. They had simply been too blind to see her.